Please join me and welcome Paul from Amp, and we will be talking about from segmentation to agents, scaling enterprise personalization with reinforcement learning. Hello there, Paul.
Hello, Tanwa. Nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us at AI Evolution, and I am really excited to talk about AMP today because it resonates with one of my thesis on what AI could totally do. Like we can totally change how business interact with consumers in a way that was not possible pre-AI. But before we go there, can you briefly do a self-introduction and just briefly touch on what AMP is before we dive deeper during our session?
Sure. I'm dialing in from San Francisco. Just recently moved here actually from Singapore. So I spent quite a while in India and Southeast Asia. I spent a lot of time in Bangkok as well. Um, I'm originally from the US, East Coast of the US, and my my career has sort of crossed three distinct spaces. I started my career in the Department of Defense in the 2000s in the US, building data systems and inference systems for large unstructured data in conflict environments. And then I spent quite a few years in research in cognitive systems, cognitive science, thinking about how humans make decisions in complex environments under conditions of
Mhm.
uncertainty, probabilistic kind of environments, which are most environments, is most of life. And then the last 12 years specifically, mostly building consumer technology, specifically consumer applications, both on the brand side across real estate. I co-founded a fintech company in India. So it was a mobile app that did lending. And then we started AMP in 2020. And we started it with the view that the full software stack was changing and that there was a big opportunity to build software in service of humans, in service of human
Mhm.
applications and business applications in a much more scalable, specific, contextual way. And so, yeah, that's what we'll get into a little bit today. That's the intro for me. What AMP is about, if I summarize it, is what we call agentic infrastructure. And what that means is the typical software stack today, conventionally how we've been building it over the last 12, 20, 30 years, has been layers of why we call it a stack is it's kind of like these layers. And each of those layers is what I would call a rule system. And so humans program rules and then those rules are automated and instantiate in the world.
Mhm.
And when we say agentic infrastructure, what we mean is instead of creating a rule system and then following those rules, we instantiate this notion of an agent for every single end user of the businesses that use our infrastructure. And so we provision and instantiate that agent, and that agent is responsible for communicating with that user. And when we say communication, what we mean is every time there's a touch point, every time there's an interaction. So every screen, every notification, every email, if a business is rendering information on a two-dimensional screen in an interaction with the user, that should be modulated by an agent who has a reference to that user's history, who has been specifically tasked to learn the different ways that you could interact in order to add value to that end user, in order to strengthen the relationship between the business and the customer, the end user.
Mhm.
So AMP provides that infrastructure, and how that's changing with the rest of the stack is very much a big aspect of evolution and innovation. We can talk about that more. But the key thing is that it is solving for and providing a function that historically has not been there.
Mhm. So for users who have used LLM or chatbot models, right? The idea of having something that is customized to that user's behavior is probably natural, but AMP take it to the level that is, from my understanding, you have millions, like hundreds of millions of production AI agents in running in AMP. Like, what's the biggest hurdle in taking something that user familiar with at like, one-to-one level. Like I'm familiar with ChatGPT know my names, know, the age of my son. But then you have to take that, building all of this infrastructure and make it run at production scale. Like what's the technical hurdle there?
Well, there's a lot to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's why we've raised, upwards of $30 million. And I think we're um, continue to solve lots of interesting challenges there. There's a technical scaling issue of provisioning for those agents. I think the even more interesting and harder challenge is scaling a agency and agents within an enterprise context,
Mm-hmm.
where an enterprise is basically shifting a lot of its systems of control from a very high and coarse sort of rules-based system into a very specific granular user level system. And evolving those systems of control and managing them at scale uh, is is certainly the I would say the biggest challenge, and it's one we've spent a lot of time designing workflows around. Agentic workflows, I think, are going to increasingly be something you hear about. Um, and in a sense, it's not too dissimilar from how we work as humans. You're going to have the most brilliant person, and if you don't build processes, right, organizations don't scale. And so, how do you build similar processes that are enabled by the agency of those agents and the responsibility of those agents? And that, and then I think that will determine which businesses thrive in this new world and which businesses struggle.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we're familiar with businesses segment consumers, users into groups or do A/B testing on us, right? But now that AMP comes in with this agentic infrastructure for businesses to be able to interact with their own customers in a new individualized way, how do you see this fundamentally change the personalization paradigm of the business?
Well, it just really becomes hyper specific.
Mm,
An agent can take advantage of so much rich context. So instead of just communicating around this rigid framework of the user has done this, next this, there's so many possible paths a customer can take through their discovery process. Imagine an e-commerce app. Um, a lot of times I've seen some brilliant marketers describe it this sort of a customer spends 90% of their time in discovery and only 10% of it in shopping. And by shopping we mean checking out, handling the payment, etc. And um and that's been an opportunity lost for many e-commerce platforms in the sense that if they get consigned to just the payment layer, to just the transaction layer, and all of the shopping happens in TikTok and then through Google and on the open web, then that's all lost context for
mhm,
that business. But to play in that space means you need to be able to interact with all that context. And that's what agents represent, is the ability to move far beyond just a rigid, static A/B test and move more towards active learning in active continual learning in response to that end user. I'm sitting here in San Francisco and just was just coming up the street and stopped at the last stoplight waiting for a Waymo to pass. And I was just thinking about that context that, when you design for a Waymo, you have to, when you design for autonomous driving, it's not just about learning the rules of the road in the sense of stop at a stoplight and don't turn right on red. And in some places you can turn right on red. The autonomous challenge of autonomous driving is just constantly responding to real world, real time context. So you have to not just know that this is a one-way street or a two-way street and that you're driving on the right side or the left side. You have to know that, hey, somebody just walked into the road in front of me, or there's traffic and I need to kind of reroute based on that. And it's sort of similar if businesses operated just on the assumption that roads were very clean and structured and there was nothing else happening, it was just, go in one direction and turn right and then turn left and you're there. That's that's an imaginary world. The real world is full of traffic and other people moving around and again, rich context. And so being able to respond to that context is, I think, what agentic infrastructure represents.
hmm So, like, let me paint um, a very exciting picture of what Paul just tells you, the audience. Imagine, like, me as a technical person, one of the things that happened to me all the time is that I would go to a SaaS website somewhere, and I have to go through copywriting of like how great this product is, what it does. And 90% of that content I already know because I'm a technical person, right? I want to know the 10% content that is really deeply technical. And most of the time, I have to hunt through documentation to really find what I'm looking for. What Paul was saying is that with agentic infrastructure of AMP, a SaaS provider could actually know that due to my browsing history or due to my behavior on this website in previous sessions, I am a deeply technical person. And rather than serving me a cookie cutter copywriting on the website, it could really serve me the technical stuff that I really want to know. And that would, one, save me time, and then two, push me to make my purchasing decision much quicker. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's about right. Although I would say you picked probably one of the more challenging places. And in a sense, I think people will probably see slower progress on the side of SaaS and, for instance, software buying.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would just warn is don't let that mislead you that the progress isn't happening. It's just we're probably zeroed in on the wrong example. Why I say that is because software selling, like knowing you, Tanwa, is usually people do software selling. It's still a very high human interaction problem. You're still going to talk to people. You're making a big organizational decision, which is why a lot of vendors will, if you're going to make a big purchase, they're going to come to your office. So you're going to work across many modalities, and you're probably going to be looking across many different kind of properties. Um, Most businesses have to face the challenge that they can only observe what happens within their property. So, on their website, within their application, they don't really get to track you across a lot of other, it's almost like you don't get to watch somebody in their house. You only get to watch them when they're in your house.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say the analogy that's happening much quicker is on the consumer side. So think of it like a bank or an e-commerce or ride-hailing app or food delivery app or a meditation or fitness app where you're spending time in that application, continually using it to kind of get what you want. That's where you want to remove a lot of the noise because you've learned something about that person over time, you've interacted with them, and you're able to kind of suggest things as they become relevant to them, and interact because it's continuous and it's fluid because you're operating in that same modality, that same space. Whereas software is still, because it's such a high purchase item, there's still a lot of things that happen outside of the modality of the AI. Right now, we
Mm-hmm.
don't have AIs yet that can work um, in three-dimensional space. Robotics is still new. I'm sure we'll get there, but we're not quite there yet. We're still getting to the point where enterprises can interact with voice data in a very fluid way. So actively take conversations and convert them into intent and convert them into meaning that you can then carry forward. Um, but generally speaking, it's just a question of when and what the different curves are at which we reach those. And ultimately, yes, we want not just one rigid website that presents information the same way to everyone. You as a technical person with an engineering background versus someone who doesn't understand that, you really should be consuming different kind of information. And yeah, that's the job of the agent, is to
Mm-hmm.
modulate that information you see so that you reduce your consumption and you increase your decision points, the things you want to actually do, right? You don't need
Mm-hmm.
to like see and learn about all these things that are not directly relevant to you.
Mm-hmm. Or going to a news website and see sports news when I never really watched sports in my life, right? So that kind
That's
of
right.
thing would uh, really cater to each specific consumer of that application or of that, use cases. It's exciting. So one
Yeah.
of the things that happen when businesses use agent in the product is that you are relying on non-deterministic technology, right? You have LLM that could hallucinate something out, or you have crosstalk between different agents that are crashing together. And with AMP processing millions, billions, trillions of AI-driven decisions monthly, what does the technical infrastructure look like to coordinate the communication between each of the agent, and how do you resolve the inevitable crashes between their decisions when that happens?
Right. So a key concept is in probabilistic and learning systems is that any given interaction is composed of many possible subcomponents that matter. And so when I tell you about a particular restaurant in your city. I'm telling you about the dish, but I'm also telling you at a specific time within a specific window of your
Mm,
week, of your day. I'm also describing that food in very specific ways in terms of why you care about it. Are you trying to gain weight? Are you trying to lose weight? Are you trying to eat something delicious? So, well, what I would say is that a fundamental challenge is the coordination challenge. And when an agent is interacting, the difficulty that they face is that high dimensions means if they want to learn that user across all of those dimensions, if they have to stay and learn just from those dimensions, then they lose out on the learning from everybody else in the platform. In a sense, it's like this: like you can only go to one or a restaurant for lunch, right? You only have on a given day, you only get to eat one lunch. There's a limit to the size of our stomachs, right? And to the time that we have in the day. And so imagine you come to a city and you're new in that city or you haven't eaten out in a while. That lunch is pretty special and you want to make the most of it. And so ideally you can learn from other people's lunches. So you can
mm,
kind of context map and say, look, if somebody went, I love pad thai, but somebody else went to this particular restaurant and had pad thai and it was terrible, right? Then I don't have to have that I don't have to have that terrible experience. I can bypass it. And if it was great, I can learn from that and see, yes, that's where I want to go eat. So the opportunity for AMP, the technical infrastructure, is actually to build coordination
mm,
into the agents themselves so that coordination becomes like cross-user learning becomes the core architectural benefit of working with something like AMP. Now, then it falls on the business to sort of say, all right, well, coordination is ultimately a series of trade-offs. And so it becomes the strategic job of the business is to manage those trade-offs. Do I want you to, eat one additional meal, or could I get you to actually develop a new use case and sort of actually
mm,
order a late night snack, or use my application to order coffee? And in the short term, that comes at the trade-off of ordering lunch because maybe I didn't tell you about lunch. But in the long term, it comes from a much bigger relationship with that end user. And so that becomes the business's job is to figure out, what do I care about? Am I pushing a new line of business? Am I developing a new product I want to expose users to? Do I want to give a discount to that user because I believe it will cause that user to come back and become a loyal customer? Those become the strategic kind of choices and the tactical coordination across those. So, for example, we have an application that uses Southeast Asia that has about 80 million agents running in a
mm,
given month, right? And so the tactical job of those agents coordinating amongst each other is the job of the infrastructure. And then the business's job is to sort of say, all right, well, here's strategically how we should nudge and push uh, those decisions in one way or another based on the goals of the business.
mhm. Okay, so the decision factors in how to orchestrate the agents, like how long to wait, how much cross-user pollination should happen, comes from business decision more than technical barriers or technical limitations.
No, no. So all those sub decisions in terms of do you like to see heavy images or
Mm,
more, do you like to really read the text? Do you like information to be presented in this way or that way? That ultimately is really delegated to the agent because they're
Mm-hmm.
able to much more rapidly learn and coordinate amongst themselves. Businesses are more just focusing on like higher level metrics and higher level kind of. I'll give you an example of a recourse e-commerce platform in Australia, where um, they have multiple different categories of e-commerce and fashion. And in the previous year, they had bought a lot of athleisure, kind of yoga wear, fitness
Mm-hmm.
wear. Okay. And that was because they saw sales growing. Well, it turned out in well into this year, the sales had dropped off considerably. And so the marketing teams were making the decision to communicate more about some of the professional wear verticals that were selling more strongly. But the business had already invested in that athleisure, so they wanted to get it off their books. They wanted to kind of disperse it. And so then
Mm-hmm.
that becomes that decision point where you've got a set of 100,000 users who might respond to one or the other. What's the marginal value of an addition of selling an athleisure item versus selling a new professional, a pair of work shoes or a really nice formal dress? Um, that's more of like a kind of almost like an operational challenge and it becomes a financial question. The tactics of which one to talk about to the user becomes the agent problem. And they'll do whatever you tell them, right? They'll say, this user, if we're just going to respond to the user, then we should really be talking about this formal dress because they're
Mm-hmm.
more likely to respond to it. But hey, if it's worth twice as much to sell an extra pair of yoga pants, then I will do my best to try those yoga pants because even if we sell fewer of them, they're worth so much more, right? You see what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Yeah.
That's where the intersection of business and technical kind of takes root.
Mhm. So speaking of business impacts, by many surveys and reports, one of the biggest concern of business executives when thinking about adopting agentic technology, agentic product, is the impact on their business, right? Business metrics and ROI indicators. In your experience, when you talk to an enterprise clients who are already using traditional MarTech, right, segmentation, A/B testing, what specific business metrics that you have experienced that could totally convince these executives or businesses to adopt AMP, agentic infrastructure for their product?
Yeah. So clarity around what your business objectives are is key for the selection and development of any technology, certainly for the evolution of like shifting from rules-based software to agentic
Mm,
software. Um, those business metrics usually come down to revenue, all right?
mhm,
And revenue can be in the form of, let's say, if your e-commerce could come in the form of gross merchandise value, net merchandise value. It can come in the form of transactions per customer, transaction size. So, do I have a customer who's regularly buying small items? Can I move them up to where they're buying more expensive items or more things in combination? The fantastic thing about Agentic and why I don't see a slowing pace of adoption is that by definition, it means the agent, in order for the agent to actually calibrate against the user, they have to have something to measure against. In technical
mhm,
terms, we call that a reward. Like in reinforcement learning, we have this
mhm,
concept of reward. That's what the agent optimizes for. That's what they work against. And so they're able to technically measure that reward and measure the trade-offs against that reward in a way that is far superior to how we do as humans. They're just machines by definition, and they measure things a lot better than us.
mhm,
And so, whereas an old Martech stack, you kind of had to kind of guess a lot when you estimated total cost of value because you'd put it into system and it'd be like, here, team, use it, and if the team uses it well, you might generate some value, and if not, you don't generate some value. But is that because the tech was poor or because your people weren't that good? There's a lot of complexity there. But with agents, you can kind of get into measuring much more precisely what's working and what's not, which will allow you to shift much more rapidly, try more things, and get to value much faster. And you can track it all because the agent, by definition, is auditing their own decisions. And so they can just expose that audit to you. Um, so once businesses get to the point where they can kind of are clear about their business value, that's where we see adoption just happening very fast.
Mhm.
I'd almost say measurement of value is a core value proposition of agentic software.
Mhm. Now, speaking of measurement of values, do you see what business concern themselves with changes from the pilot phase into deployment phase? Like when they test out your product, do they care about some things more during the pilot than in the deployment, like full production deployment, or is it usually the same thing all the way around?
I would say the complexity as you extend your deployment comes from having more teams operate on the same infrastructure. In a sense, one of the classic problems for leadership in any large enterprise has always been actually internal dynamics. Like,
Hmm.
why does we all know that there's a single customer, and the customer doesn't care about whether it's the marketing team or the product team or the business team or the vertical team. They're just interacting with your brand. But we know that our systems have always been built as software for the teams, different teams. So you have the marketing team and the product, they all use different software, and that software is rules based. So they have no way of coordinating across
Hmm.
each other. That's the key theme of coordination. So what ends up happening is the customer has lots of different conversations with the brand, and the brand doesn't know, you know, the customer experience conversation is different than the marketing conversation. Agentic represents a way out of that because you can assign an agent to a user across every context. The complexity comes from having your teams begin to align around shared infrastructure because that's not something that they've been used to. They're used to
Hmm.
kind of operating in their silos with their own tools and their own technology and not talking. So usually when a company pilots, they start with one team because again, it's just easier to coordinate with one team doing their own thing. But the value proposition is to get the agent to operate across more contexts. That means bringing those additional teams in and getting them to work through their issues. Humans as humans, we are kind of like political beings. We argue, we negotiate, we compromise, and that human compromise and negotiation process is as tricky and challenging as ever. Software should be able to make it easier. Agentic software should be able to make it easier for it to be less political and more objective and more value based. Um, but there are still humps in the road, and it's still an adoption curve process. But that's what we see happening in the distinction. Once you get out of the POC, it becomes again, how can this infrastructure transform my entire business? How can I bring more teams on board and get them to adopt and then begin to align their workflows around this shared coordination mechanism?
Hmm. Now, for enterprise leaders watching this current session, who are currently stuck in with segmentation and rule-based world, like what is the practical first step for those to take toward agentic transformation? What would make their organization more ready to accept AMP into their stack?
I think it's jumping in process. I think to look more deep to educate themselves about what agentic workflows look like. A lot of time now into that ability for customers and businesses to begin to educate themselves. So I was just last week in Amsterdam, Stockholm, and Paris. I spoke at an event in Stockholm, had a whole small group event in Stockholm where there was just marketing leaders from across the industry really engaging closely and having a lot of conversations. We had a particular customer want to speak from real experience. And I think that facilitation of cross learning between organizations and the educational process has been key for us is what we see more generally. The week here in SF and speaking, a couple of different companies spoke, and again, I think the more you can push clear examples forward, and then businesses, the more they're just getting and exposing themselves to these things, the faster the process is happening, the faster the transformation process.
Right. Now, before we wrap up, what's on the horizon for AMP and how can enterprise learn more about AMP, how to get involved, where to contact you?
Yeah, we're growing very rapidly. Operate across I think over 20 markets now. Um, We have team in Southeast Asia and Europe and US. So in terms of getting involved or interest, sort of finding out more about AMP, you can definitely visit our website. You can reach out on LinkedIn or any of the social media channels, send an email. My email is paul@amp.com, so feel free to send one to me. I'll get you connected to the right team. And then other than that, I'd say participate in these kind of events. I think there's so much change happening, education, that so much change happening in technology. You can't rely on what you knew from 5 and 10 years ago. You got to stay agile, stay young in your mindset. And but we're seeing so much cool success and growth that's happening. And it's a really exciting time, I think, to be a business leader.
All right. Too bad we only have half an hour to talk to you, Paul. That has been very, very fun for me and very educational. Thank you again for joining at AI Evolution, and hopefully we can invite you back in the future.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye.